Thank you for joining us today as we take up more of the content and material in Module 3. The focus is largely on identity and access management, then access control and encryption. So between identity and access management, access control, and encryption, these are the three main methods that we use to implement security, to restrict access to unauthorized users. And so you can consider these the Holy Trinity or the Three Musketeers of system security. And essentially, in our previous session, we talked about how far we've strayed from a sensible approach to device and data security, right? We showed how the default at each root of a disk drive is set to allow any user read and execute privileges, and authenticated users the ability to modify things. So that's really insane when you think about it. What we want to do today, though, is to focus a bit more. We want to refresh the trail on security account management and just brush up on the difference between workgroup scenarios and enterprise scenarios. And then we want to cover the basics about role-based access control. Most of us are familiar with discretionary access. Okay, so when you look at our assignments and what's significant to understand here is that, well, the first assignment has to do with two-factor authentication. So it's a very straightforward approach to setting up authentication using more than one factor. And that's a part of the identity and access management realm. The second assignment is actually a full-scale solution. We want you to use discretionary access in a manner that's recommended. And most people don't. I mean, most people just accept the defaults and there's inheritance that's in place. And so you see the end result from what we demonstrated in Wednesday. A lot of times people get confused about inheritance, and so they don't take the time to learn it and implement it properly. And apart from that, the whole concept of discretionary access is the idea that it's left to the discretion of the user to determine how to configure the security. And most users just aren't equipped for that. But there is a best practice. And what we want you to do is to read up on how to implement selective access to data with discretionary access in a recommended manner, not just the default shoot from the hip. Yeah, I have data on my stuff. I can share it in my home network. Oh, there's an option. It's called friends and family. There's all sorts of really cool, slick, quick ways to share data, right? But there's a better way to do this. The third solution, we're asking you to log in to an enterprise environment. So we're going to provide you with access to a remote server that's part of an Active Directory domain. It's an enterprise environment. And what we want you to do is to create access to resources with a notional scenario based on our course, each of our campuses, and the university, right? So as you read up on this and then you watch the video, it'll start to make sense. But basically, the best practice that we want everyone to be very well practiced and versed with is the role-based access. And you'll notice that it's distinctly different from discretionary access. In role-based access, there's more people involved, and there's a decision process that's outside the realm of the user. We're going to cover essentials about role-based access in just a moment. The last part of the 3.3 solution is to use the built-in encryption options to protect data. So if access control is incomplete or incorrect, the fail-safe is encryption. And what we'd like you to do is experience and use the built-in encryption in an enterprise setting or Active Directory domain. Most of us have home editions of Windows. Most of us work on local networks that are private. And what we want you to do is to get a feel for or a flair for corporate or government agency environments. And so you'll have your own machine, you'll set up your own access, but you'll also have rights and privileges to use the built-in encryption features that are part of that environment. Are there any questions about the assignments? Now, one thing I want you to notice here, do you see a due date?
No.
No. I would like you to finish these as promptly as possible. Ideally, there is a due date. If you pull this up and you look, there is a due date, and it's set for the 10th at 3 p.m. So that's Monday by 3 p.m. It's Good Friday on Friday. So we don't have classes on Friday. And, setting up two-factor authentication is actually pretty quick and easy, right? So that could be done in the next few hours, a day at the most, right? If you could get this done by next Monday, and then the role-based access by the following Friday, ideally, we'd have enough time to cover a final module in our system security course about network exposure. And I'd really like to have a little bit of time to do that. For some reason, it seems like when I put a deadline out there, it starts the clock and I'm chasing down students and sending reminders. And it's not my intent to be a nuisance here. So I'm going to try something different. I just want you to get into this because this is where the rubber meets the road. This is really how you practice and implement system security on the most basic levels. You have solid definition of identity, and that's what the authentication piece is about, right? So if you get that right, that's half the battle. You can positively identify who is on this system and are they authorized to be on that system, right? That's the authentication and login piece. That's the IAM part of it. But then on the other side of it, once they're on the system, what do they specifically have permissions to access? What privileges do they possess by virtue of the groups they belong to? User groups or security groups. In the world of Linux, it's a user group. In the world of Windows, it's called a security group. In any case, before we go on, based on what we've just presented, does anyone have any questions or comments?
No.
Okay. So identity, IAM. You've seen this diagram before, correct?
Yeah.
We did show this to you before. And so identity and access management has those two sides of the fence, right? And the authentication piece involves security factors. And those are the components used to identify and authenticate an individual or a group of individuals. And yes, this is kind of a refresher, but on the other side of this world are the accounts. Accounts are called security principles. Accounts are logical representations of the user or the system or the service. And what most people don't realize is that in an enterprise environment, or even in a work group environment, you have system accounts and you have service accounts that are embedded in the operating system that provide the authority for certain services to perform their tasks. The hackers understand this. We're used to just thinking in terms of user accounts. Does anyone remember what PAM stands for?
Yeah, privileged account management.
Privileged account management. That's right. Oh yeah, it's right here. So privileged account management, we're talking about domain administrators, people who are system administrators or network managers, folks who have a level of root privilege on the technology infrastructure that far exceeds what an average user has. When you have a privileged account, it means that that account is typically embedded inside the local administrators group of each and every device that belongs in that environment. So when we say privileged, we mean this is a person whose login allows them to touch any system or device and change anything in that environment, right? It's a huge amount of power. There are special cases we have to take a look at, and multi-factor is one of them. So we've talked about multi-factor before. We wanted you to practice and use that. And we've taken that up in other courses, but we're going to keep coming back to it because the whole idea of two-factor authentication is changing even as we speak. Did I or did I not mention the fact that Microsoft just came out with a new promotion, and it has to do with logins. There's a big emphasis now to do away with passwords. Have I brought that up in class?
Yeah, I don't recall.
I believe you did when I think it was mentioning Key Vault or something like that to store passwords.
Yeah. So for the first time with Windows 11 users, Microsoft has started a campaign to ditch the password, right? They want you to use different security, what, principles or accounts? Which is it? Principles or factors? No, they want you to use factors apart from the common password. Common password is broken. So the important thing to understand is that by this time next year, there may be a lot of people with laptops and personal technology devices, and they're not using a password anymore. I mean, they have a PIN code, but this idea of Windows Hello, everybody knows that you can also, you don't have to have a security key where you enter a series of numbers. You can like drag your finger over a picture or around a number pad, and as long as the pattern is duplicated, you can get in, right? So it's a performance-based authentication. They're making more things accessible, but more about sign-in options, right? When you go to this, it basically talks about getting rid of passwords. So I was pretty shocked to see that. I've never seen that in that screen before, but that's just something worth mentioning. I'm sorry, I meant to get back here. Now, privileges again have to do with the placement. So it's really important to keep things straight in your mind about the concepts. We want to use specific terms. So when we talk about a privilege, a user has a specific privilege because they're placed within a certain group, meaning the logical representation of that user, their account, is a member of a designated group, right? And that group is just another security principle. So you can think of groups as just another security object, but it represents, you know, a designated number of individuals or systems, right? And when we say that they're in certain groups, we're talking about um, authenticated users. There's a power users group. In some versions of Windows, there's an administrators group. How many different groups do we have in here? If I go into here and look, and I look at the different types of groups, I don't see groups and users here because I have the home edition. But there's a hint of it when I go into accounts and I start talking about other users. And then I start clicking on some of these other users. You can change the account type. So when you're changing the account type, what you're doing is removing it from one group and placing it in another. That's what we're talking about. Now, it's easier to see when you're working in a server environment. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's look at this same question or same topic in a Windows Server environment. Now, this Windows Server environment is going to look and feel the same. It's going to look and feel the same as it would if my laptop were a Windows 11 Professional Edition. If I had that level of if I had that edition of the operating system, then I could open up my file explorer, and I'm hoping my system is going to be responsive here. What's going on? This is becoming a pattern where it seems like 3 something each day around this time. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, we were having issues with screen shares. Let me see if I can prompt my server to respond. That's really irritating. I was going to show you something. Let's see if I can connect to another system. Yeah. There we go. Can everybody still see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's good to have more than one system in the mix when stuff like this happens. So this is another server, much like the one we were just looking at. Can everybody see local users and groups?
Yeah.
Who would think that you could have so many different groups? Now this is, okay, we have a few more groups on a server than we do in the Windows 10 or Windows 11 Professional Edition or Corporate Edition. Is there anyone in our class that's using an Education Edition, Corporate Edition, Enterprise Edition, Professional Edition,
No, I think I'm using the standard.
the Home Edition?
Yes, the home edition.
Yes, okay. Well, if you have the Home Edition, you'll have the same resource. It's called Local Users and Groups when you go into computer management, which you can also get to by right-clicking the name of the computer and then just selecting Manage with a Windows Professional Edition. Even in the client operating system, you have administrators, power users, users, guests, print operators, and remote desktop users, right? So this is what allows people to connect remotely to a system. You have to be a member of the remote desktop users group. So if you're a member of the group, backup operators, then you have privileges because you're there. Obviously, if you're a power user, you have more privileges than you do if you're just a regular user. And this is true for the corporate editions of Windows, and not so much in the home edition. But in the home edition, it says, again, it just refers to it a little differently. I'm going to go ahead and back out of this for a second. Yeah, I'm going to close this and see if it'll send the shutdown signal. Might have to restart it again. Oh, it's doing something. Oh, it decided to wake up. Isn't that nice? Yeah. Okay. We'll just park that for now. Where were we? Oh, in the home edition of Windows, you can basically click on something and then can change the account type. So when you're saying changing the account type, you're really talking about what group does it belong to. Any questions? That's the consumer version or home edition of most operating systems, and Linux as well. Just remember that privileges has to do with groups, and permissions. When you hear the word permissions, a lot of people make a huge mistake. They associate permissions with a user. But permission assignments are not associated with a user. I mean, in a manner of speaking, they are, but permissions are an attribute of file system objects. So one of the gaps in security theory or system security is having a proper frame of reference. Every file system object is endowed with a set of permissions or permission attributes. And it's those permission attributes that are assigned either to individual user accounts or to groups. When you're working discretionary access, most often a user is assigning a permission to another user account. That's bad. It's generally not a good practice to assign permissions, specific permissions, to enable specific permissions for a file system object on that object for a given individual user. because think of users as honeybees. In the life of in the history of an organization, a user, their role often changes. They're promoted, they're transferred to a different department. There's a kind of a flow and ebb to what a person does the longer they stay in an organization. And what happens with discretionary access is that users or colleagues that work alongside an individual tend to grant permission to an individual user account. And the problem is that as that user changes departments, those permissions follow them because they're assigned to the individual, not to their role or their duties and responsibilities or their official title. That's the most important distinction between discretionary access, where a user says, okay, I'm working with Joe today, or I'm working with Mary next week, and they share data and they change permissions on an object to include a single user account, right? Now you've already seen what happens with inheritance. And another thing that happens between Windows and Linux users is that people fail to understand how recursion in a Linux environment works just like inheritance. So one of the things I want you to understand is that if you issue a command in Linux for a file system object and you use the -R feature or attribute, right? You turn that on, that applies down into the lower levels of directories. So whether you're talking about recursion in Linux or inheritance in Windows, it's important at a very basic minimum, and this is something we demonstrated in our last class, those permissions propagate all the way down into the different subdirectories. And you have to really understand where or how you want to block those permissions at a certain level or for a certain subdirectory. So one of the things that we want to advocate here is that when it comes to access control, we want people to think intentionally about roles. And when we're talking about roles, we're talking about an organization view. What I'd like to do now is kind of segue into a couple of slides the author of our textbook provided. And they're looking and reviewing role-based access control on a very high level. And your textbook author explains that when someone is assigned a specific role in an organization, there are certain criteria that have to be met, or even role-based access control can be ineffective, right? So you see here, it says a user can only be assigned to one role in the set, either during a session or statically. So in real time or as a permanent assignment. What we mean by that is for a given job description, there should be a corresponding group, a security group that is created explicitly and exclusively for that role. And what's different about role-based access control is permissions are never, ever assigned to an individual account. They're only assigned to the user group or the security group. And a user has rights only because they're a member of the group. No individual user accounts are assigned. That's discretionary access. And again, that's not the best way here. Now, it says mutually exclusive roles. Any permission or access right can be granted to only one role in the set. So you have some data. What they're saying is, under ideal circumstances, the leadership and the team in an organization come together and they say, okay, in order to protect this data, we want to exclude anyone who doesn't need access to that data, right? So there are role-based decisions that have nothing to do with the tech, but really have more to do with the process in the organization. And that part of role-based access control can be a little foreign to tech folks because we're used to just issuing a command and changing a setting and we go on about our work. But it's important to understand the role an individual has before you give them the keys to the castle. Here's another one. Cardinality has to be a part of role-based access control. And by cardinality, we mean you have to say that individuals can only participate in a maximum number of roles. If you establish access to data based on security groups or user groups, the bookkeepers group, the registrars group, student affairs group, the instructor and faculty group, students, right? If you have a single person who is a member of each of those roles, each of those groups, basically your security is blown to hell. What am I saying? You could have a student who is also a member of the staff part-time. Oh, and they're also working in the IT department, right? And so they're a member of so many groups that basically they have an unholy level of access. So that's one aspect of role-based access control you have to watch out for. So prerequisite roles, right? You have to be a member of the finance group in order to do, if you're going to be doing accounting or bookkeeping, you have to be a member of the finance group. So this is another aspect of role-based access control and how to structure it in an organization. It says dictates that a user can only be assigned to a particular role if it is already assigned to some other specified role. By that, they mean in order for you to be a member of the bookkeeper group, you have to be a part of the finance group, right? The bookkeeper group is one of the prerequisites is that it has to be a part of the finance group. Now that's probably an oversimplified example, but the important thing to understand is that you can't have too many roles. And if your role changes, you have to be excluded from that group. So when we say mutually exclusive roles, we mean if you move from position to position, if you're promoted and you move to a different department, that new role excludes you from access in the previous role. In so many words, that's what we're talking about here. So the important thing is to understand that even role-based access control isn't a magic bullet if certain standards or criteria aren't understood and observed. Now, can everybody see this screen?
Yes.
Okay. And can everybody see, you've all heard about an org chart, right? An organizational chart?
Yeah.
Okay, so an organizational chart is basically a role hierarchy. And one of the things that you don't get about an org chart is that sometimes there are dependencies between the roles. For example, the engineer at this level may report to the production engineer number one and quality engineer number one because those are supervisors that concern themselves with, well, how efficient they are and how good they are, right? So in terms of a management the management component of a team, an engineer may answer to more than one person, but every organization is different. So the first thing that you have to do when you're starting with role-based access control is to understand who reports to who. Put another way, if I have a project lead here, I don't want these engineers to be a part of this project lead's group. I'm thinking I seriously need to come up with a different diagram to help explain that aspect of it. But you have an entire engineering department, and one, I would put an engineering department up here for an org chart, right? And then there's a lead director, and there might be an executive assistant, and then you have different departments and so on. The whole idea is to understand the uniqueness of hierarchy at every organization because it's different in every organization. But the most important thing to understand, and this is where we're going to close today, okay? These are the 4 bullets you want to go over and over and over again. When we talk about role-based access control, we're talking about the organization making a team decision about who is authorized to work certain data. That has to happen first. And based on the organization chart and the team decisions, only then do the tech professionals or system security professionals create the appropriate groups. Now, what are we saying? For every role, there is a defined security principle. For every specific role in an organization, a person, a job function, a position, there is a security group. Now, the first thing that most people wrestle with is this idea that, well, that sounds like a lot of work, because if I'm dealing with a person who has a unique role, aren't they like a group of one? And the answer is yes. You can have a lot of people who have unique roles, and there's only one of those roles in an entire organization. But what you don't realize is that when people change duties and responsibilities, when their roles change, if you set this up front, all you do is take them out of one group and add them to the other group, and none of the security is compromised. See, people never set this up on the front side. They never take the time to map this out and figure out, okay, which groups do we need? Now, if you're in Windows, that's called a security group. It's still a security principle, right? If you're in Linux, it's called a user group. It works the same way. The thing I want you to understand is that group membership is how privileges are extended so that people can access, right? Permission or access rights are set up for the created group. Then a subject, so in your textbook, it calls subjects, that references user accounts. So when they talk about subjects, they're talking about a user account. A subject is added to the group. When the role assignment changes, the group membership is changed, right? So a member of the HR staff is promoted to director, right? That's a role change. Then they become the HR director group. And you're saying, well, what if there's only one director? Yeah, that's right. There's only one director. Well, why should I create a group if it's just one account? That just seems counterintuitive. Doesn't it seem like extra work? Okay, we have 60 seconds left of class today, and I just want you to unmute your mic. Do you think it's intuitive or sensible to create extra groups if we're only talking about a single user?
No.
Doesn't that seem like extra work?
Yes.
Yes.
It does.
Oh yeah.
It does. And did you know that that initial impression is the very reason why nobody ever does it? Well, few organizations do it properly. Put another way, when the technical staff or security team create the groups for the roles, they never have to create the roles again. It's kind of like laying the foundation for a house. If the foundation is good, if you want access control to work right, the concrete, the foundation upon which everything is built, doesn't happen on the system with the tech in the first place. It happens in the organization, and it's a conversation you have, and you figure out, and then somebody maps out, okay, what divisions, what departments, how many groups, and then once that's in place, all you do is drop people inside the group. What happens if somebody goes on maternity leave? And let's say that the HR person that goes on maternity leave has 57 directories and 10 applications for which they have unique privileges. But it's keyed to that one person, the individual, and they're on maternity leave. What does your IT team have to do now? What does your security staff have to do now to give the stand-in, the temporary, access to 10 different applications on 6 different systems with 57 different directories? Who wants to stay late to do that?
Nobody.
Nobody.
What would happen instead if your temp hire, your temporary hire came in and they said, yeah, I'm filling in. Susan had a great delivery and the baby's doing well. She should be back in 6 weeks. Well, okay, but how do we get you what you need to get your job done? Nothing. It's already taken care of. What did you do? You removed Susan from HR staff. Or maybe Susan's the director, right? Maybe there's an interim director. So you remove Susan, you put the interim director's name in that group, and lo and behold, all 10 apps on 6 systems with 57 directories are instantaneously accessible. Which means if it's done right, it's a thing of beauty. And it also means that if it's done wrong and hackers get in the mix, oh my gosh. Well, that's what they do anyway. They insert themselves into the administrator's group. I want you to think about this last little detail. Hackers understand how this works. They use it ruthlessly. If we have any hope of securing systems, we have to do it correctly. You can't build a house on sand. If you do it correctly, the hackers are locked out. When there are changes in the organization, there are no gaps. You have gaps in process, in security settings. When there's transition, there is no transition. If some temporary person comes in to fill in, you just change their membership. And then when they're done, you change it back. That's it. You go home, you have a life, and there's no loose ends. The big bad wolf is outside the house, huffing and puffing. You've all heard the story about the 3 little pigs before, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, the 3 little pigs, think of it this way. Every security group you take the time to create for a given role, it's like a brick house for the 3 little pigs. The wolves are going to huff and puff, but they're never going to get in there. I know that's an oversimplification. And wouldn't it be nice if security was as simple as what we learned in nursery school, right? Okay. But this is it right here. This is the one slide that helps explain what role-based access control is all about and the basics for how it works. But the best way to appreciate it is to actually do it and use it. And that's what the solution is about. When you get a chance to do it and use it for yourself, you get a chance to see, okay, this isn't so hard to do. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, now when you make a change, it's seamless and there are no security gaps. The permissions are not in a state of change where hackers can step in. It's the transition and the change that create the gaps that cause the problems. Okay. Based on the material we've presented, does anyone have any thoughts or questions or comments?
No, sir.
Anything based on the assignments or the solutions that we covered?
No, not yet. When I get to
Okay.
it.
Friday is Good Friday. We won't have class. These are self-paced. There is a study guide. It is the final version of the study guide in place right now in the references. This will not change. Okay. You don't have to spend as much time in the slides or the textbook, but it would be great if you could get as far along as you can. Next week, we'll practice role-based access control and we'll start dabbling with encryption. Okay? Now,
Got it.
everybody remembers this, yeah?
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. So role-based access control in this environment, that's where it works. That's the ideal setting for it. This environment, the only thing you have to work with is discretionary access, right? You can still do role-based access in a work group, but it's, oh my gosh, it's a lot more complicated. So anyway, all right. If I don't see you before then, have a safe, pleasant, and blessed Easter.
You
You
too.
too.
Yep, and I'll remain available in case you have any issues or challenges with your assignment or solutions, okay?
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye for now.